way. This panel has been tasked to examine Ukraine's social and national cohesion by assessing four main issues. And now this will help us gauge not only the level of social stability in Ukraine, but also the vulnerabilities that Moscow and its proxies can try to exploit to their advantage. First, inter-ethnic and interfaith relations, including the consolidation of Ukrainian national identity in a war setting, and how this affects state policy, education, language use, media, and so forth. And of course, very importantly, the impact of the recognition of the independence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on interfaith and inter-ethnic relations, particularly at local levels. Second, I'm just giving some ideas for the panelists, but these are my thoughts. Second, class relations, which one can analyze, of course, in Marxist terms through the prism of class struggle, or, which I prefer, in terms of an emerging and sustainable class structure and a functioning market economy. We have heard a good deal about the small oligarchic class over many years. What about Ukraine's middle class, its working class, and its agricultural class? How have the political changes and Russia's invasion affected their well-being, their organization, and their commitment to Ukraine? Do they view the class structure as fair and legitimate? Third, regional differences. I think it's valuable to assess national identity, if we can, the state of national identity in Donbass, the Donbass region after the Russian invasion. But in addition to Donbass, are any other regions of Ukraine vulnerable to destabilization, ethnic disputes, or proxy insurgencies? The Kremlin has tried to engineer Hungarian-Ukrainian conflicts, as we know, in Transcarpathia, as well as Polish-Ukrainian clashes in Halichina. Are other regions potentially vulnerable, such as Chernivtsi with its Romanian population, or the southern part of the Odessa region with its incredible mix of ethnicities along the Danube and Black Sea Delta? Has the Novorossiya project been abandoned, fully abandoned by Putin, or simply placed on hold? And are there any other Russian-speaking populations outside the Donbass susceptible to subversion and manipulation by Kremlin agents? And fourth, civil-military relations, which I believe not only concerns reforms that all NATO aspirants have to complete in terms of civilian control of the military, but in Ukraine's case, the stature of soldiers and combatants who are fighting to defend Ukraine from another Muscovite takeover. Has the war intensified patriotism, commitment to military service, respect and welfare for veterans? Has the military now achieved the same high status in Ukraine that it has in Poland? Lastly, with parliamentary elections imminent, how will ethnicity, religion, class, region, and other identities likely to figure in the voting? What will Moscow and any pro-Moscow parties be able to exploit to their advantage? Will they be able to fragment parliament and push the federalization agenda that's designed to neutralize decision-making in Kyiv? And what will all this mean for President Volodymyr Zelensky, who will, I think, be seriously tested by Moscow in the coming months? To answer these questions and others, we have selected the best possible panelists to tackle these questions and look at the issues of national stability, group relations, and so forth. They'll need no major introduction. They're already introduced. I'm not going to repeat in the handouts. In order of appearance, Kyle Parker, US Helsinki Commission Chief of Staff, our old friend David Kramer, who's now at Florida International University, and Louis Madanick, Open World Program. And if I could ask you to grade Ukraine's progress or regress in each of these four domains at the end of your presentation, I would say on a scale of A to E, with E meaning dire and A meaning full harmony. That would be very helpful, otherwise Walter's threatened not to pay me. I would also give my own grades. I would also give my grades at the end of our session and try to come up with an average. So let us begin with Kyle. I don't know if you want to use the podium, Kyle.
Thank you, Janusz. I'll speak here in regards from Bob Hand, who reminded me you were the only person who came and saw him when he was in Novi Pazar, way back when.
People all over the place.
Exactly. Well, anyway, it's good to be amongst friends. When I got the note from my uncle Walter, I of course, is that on? I of course agreed to speak on whatever panel he put me in. So, and I on the way over here, I took a look and saw that we'd be talking about social cohesion, and figured, well, we'll give it a run. I actually was in Ukraine recently for the first round of the recent elections. It was my third election to observe. I observed the first round with my colleague Rachel Bauman, who's here in the audience covering Ukraine Commission. We observed in Odessa. We had a partner from Denmark. Is this Chatham House rules, or are we on the record? Or
You're being
just camera's right here. Just the Russian embassy, right? Yeah, no, it was interesting. I only learned later that our Danish parliamentarian. I said, who was she? We were just so tired, and election observation is such a grueling thing to do. He said, no, she's sort of like the Dana Rohrabacher of Denmark. And I said, no, maybe it's just as well that we didn't get into much beyond small talk and the count and all that in Odessa. But yeah, I'd previously done the 2014 election in the northern Kiev Oblast and did the 2010 runoff in Kharkov, and got stuck with David and others during Snowmageddon on the way back. So that was fun. And I also feel like I am sort of, kind of half a Ukrainian by marriage. My wife is from Eastern Ukraine, from Kharkov. So I have always appreciated having that Eastern perspective. I studied Russian literature in Kharkov in 1999, and so stay in close contact with in-laws, and it's really been something to see how how this whole conversation has developed, particularly social cohesion, language, interfaith conflict, and all of that. And I also, coming from the OSCE world, appreciate the notion of grading Ukraine here. We do a number of implementation review meetings that David, back in your State Department days, would often lead our delegations to, where we, as the 57 participating states, come together and I would say it's a shared responsibility out of even friendship. We kind of hold each other to account, right? The standard should be higher amongst friends, and do it in a variety of areas. I don't know that I'm prepared to assign A through E grades. I kind of like to use it, simplified it the same way I recommend members, how I recommend members of Congress to vote when we're at these big things. I have three symbols. I have a plus, a minus, or an equal. Equal means vote your conscience, plus means yay, and minus means negative. But on the stable interethnic relations, I sort of see that probably almost interlinguistic relations. I'm wondering that we're really probably speaking about the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine and the Ukrainian-speaking parts more so than some of the smaller minorities. Although obviously there's been some things that have been whipped up in the West, particularly the Hungarian community and others, and that's been a real problem with Hungary kind of blocking Ukraine on a number of things in NATO. But I think on that one I would have to say perhaps a minus, perhaps a slight minus with the recent language law, and to me it will be very interesting as we see this exciting political moment unfold. A president who's able to excite my in-laws, who live 30 miles from the Russian border, and I think, with all due respect to the in-laws, watch a little too much Russian TV, to see that I suspect they voted for him, and also to see that indeed some folks in the West also voted for him. And so, to see just exactly how that sensitive question of the place of Russian language and culture in Ukraine, and how that develops, and does Ukraine go further down a path that might look a little more like what we've seen in the Baltics? Of course, again, a different situation, much smaller countries, much forcibly and illegally occupied, as of course parts of Ukraine now are? Or does it drift more in a Canadian model, where you can be in Toronto and you speak English, and if someone says, "Well, are you an Englishman?" No. Or what are you, an American then? No, I'm Canadian. You speak French? No. You might speak French, but you're not any more or less of a Canadian if you speak French or don't speak French, and the same being true in Quebec. And I feel like we've seen, that was a consciousness that really, I think, emerged immediately after the outbreak of the war in the East. I don't know, you probably all remember when the mayor of Lviv recorded that public service announcement that went viral, where he addressed the residents of the Donbass and other things in Russian and said, "Come to Lviv, you're welcome here," and regretted that greater ties had not been built. So obviously Zelensky's well positioned to make some headway there, and it will be particularly interesting to see how that goes. Again, not so much for what it means to the global audience. I think we all know, the nonsense of Russian propaganda and discrimination against Russian speakers, but just not wanting to make any more fertile ground for Russian propaganda to fall on significant portions of Ukraine's territory, and of course millions of Ukrainian citizens. Moving right along interfaith relations, of course we have the Thomas. Again, I think in the plus minus equals, I would say for maybe an equal, right? I mean, on the international stage, you had obviously criticism of the Russian Church. You had them belittling the Fenar, right? To try to sort of put Bartholomew in his place, accusing Poroshenko of injecting politics into faith, which I think was a fair criticism. Well, of course, Putin's one to levy it. But at least in my experience, and others may have, other panelists here may have a different view, but at the level of the common believer in the village, to me, I haven't seen that cause too much strife. And I went, when I was there shortly after this, to the Pečerskaya Lavra and heard that there was some difficulty there. You wouldn't have known anything happened. On class relations, I was looking at that, Janusz, a little bit more when I saw that on the Marxist sort of perspective, and think that, this is where you don't necessarily want stability. And I think the Zelensky phenomenon was some injection of instability there, sort of in some sense, a reaction against the oligarchic class, right? I thought it was particularly rich to hear Poroshenko in the campaign say that Zelensky would lead to the oligarchization of Ukraine, and thinking, well, I guess it takes one to know one. What else do we have here? Regional differences. The Donbass, of course, the Donbass.
What grade would you give to class?
The class relations, I think, again, instability there, but a positive instability, something that needs to happen. Things need to be shaken up.
She gives it 3.
You give it a 3? Well, I guess in the old system, if I got a 3 on Ukrainian language on the State Department test, that'd be pretty darn good. And I'd get extra pay for that. On the regional concerns, obviously there, the Donbass is, and of course Crimea. Let's never forget. But looking beyond that. I still worry a little bit about Kharkov, right? Ukraine's second largest city. I think it's still, obviously Putin had designs on it. We know that very well now. Even maps and things like that. It is second biggest city in Ukraine. It sits right there, full of heavy industry, and it's got enough of both sides that if the struggle were to be tipped, as we saw it happen, earlier in 2014 when they raised the flag, and you had kind of looked to me like a Kharkov passion play right there in front of the Oblast building. I just worry that what you'd see could look a little bit like Grozny, and I mean the tragedy there. And I guess since we're at the end of my time and at the end of this, I will just just came back from the Vilnius Russia Forum, which you have this view of Baltics and you can't speak Russian and whatever, and yet they've become havens, really, these democracy shelters for Russians who have fled, for Russians who, you know, small D Democrats who need Kiev as a beacon, right, as a place of refuge and hope. And the foreign ministry there, like, you know, Estonia's done the Leonard Marie conference, they do this Vilnius Russia Forum, they ask everybody to speak in Russian, and they bring together, you know, folks from the region. The Ukrainian foreign ministry was there, and it's sort of like a TED Talks or Davos kind of talk show thing. But and it's Chatham House rules, so I can't say who this was, but in speaking with one of the Ukrainian participants, painted a very dark picture that I hope doesn't come to pass, and I wonder, again, as we move into further panels and look more at the culture and other things, just how realistic this is. But he said, look, it's amateur hour in Kiev. You've got a totally untested president. You know, there's euphoria now. There'll soon be a descent into chaos and mismanagement, screwed up. Ukraine is so heavily armed now with so many weapons. Be another Maidan, but this time it'll be armed, and this time it'll be war, civil war, and then Russia steps in essentially, and the EU looks the other way because it helps stem the refugees that will be fleeing Ukraine and other things like that. So the fact that this came from a serious Ukrainian, again, I don't necessarily share that view, but I worry about it. Ukraine's not out of the woods, and you know, we can't afford for it to fail. This is far more than a regional concern. This is really the fate of the normative order, and our post-war, as in post-World War II, investment in a Europe that is whole, free, secure, and let's not forget, at peace. And it is not at peace right now because there is a war in Europe.
So is that thumbs down?
Yeah, I'd have to say. Well, yeah, I don't know. I think it's more of an equal. Just if you look at it over.
Like this.
Yeah. I don't know that it's gotten much better or gotten much worse.
And civil military. I don't know if you want to touch that. Maybe think about it. We'll go over to the.
Hopefully.
Well, actually, I was thinking of the youth panel next.
And hopefully we can do questions. That's the most interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us, kid. By the way, David.
Thanks very much, Janusz. It's great to be back here, Walter. Thank you for bringing me back from Miami this time. I think I've only missed one of these over the years, so it's great to be back. Thank you very much. And it's great to be with this panel of distinguished experts. I just saw an hour ago this piece on Ukraine alert that came out. One Ukraine, ? Think Again, by Roman Solchanik. And the piece to me is completely off base. It holds Ukraine to a standard that we don't hold most other countries to. Are there differences in Ukraine? Absolutely. There are differences in this country. I live in a city, Miami, where the joke is it's so close to the United States and you don't need a passport to go there. Where, because I don't speak Spanish, I don't understand half the people who live in the city. So there are differences in every country. I thought for many years that this sense that Ukraine is a deeply divided country is overblown. I think it has been from day one. There are differences. There are linguistic differences, views toward Russia. Talk to people in the northern part of this country about attitudes toward Canada, and I bet you'll hear a different view. Or toward Mexico, pro and con. And I compare the United States and Ukraine with some hesitation because of the enormous differences. But I just find that this view that Ukraine is destined to be a deeply divided country and therefore will fail as a result of that, to be off base. And people look at the results of the latest election, and I was there for the second round with IRI, stayed in the Capitol. And yes, there was a strong anti-establishment vote, but there was a strong vote for Zelensky because he represented change. And we'll see how much this is for Zelensky and his new party when the Rada elections are held either in July or October, depending on the court ruling. But it seems to me that there is a hunger for change from, I think, what has cursed Ukraine for many years, which is the same kind of leadership, the same generation of leaders. And Zelensky really does represent a new change, and hopefully can bring the country more together. And I don't want to sound naive about it. Some of his appointments are cause for deep concern, specifically the head of the presidential administration. But he won with 73% of the vote. In what other country where there is a free and fair election, and I'm not talking about Russia, Belarus, or Kazakhstan, what other country is there where we would say 73% is not a mandate? It does not represent a more united position of Ukrainian voters. It was a landslide of an election. My first election in Ukraine was in '98. I was sent to Cherkasy. Cherkasy in '98, with all due respect to anyone who might be from Cherkasy, was not exactly a garden spot. It wasn't Miami. But I think back from that time to 21 years later, how far the country has come. With enormous challenges remaining. There's no question about it. Ukraine, I was saying this to Kyle earlier, and I said this in Kiev in April with IRI's press conference. Ukraine's elections have become rather boring in a way, and that's a compliment. Because when an election, when you're there as an observer to look for problems and you don't find major ones, every election has problems. My God, I live in Miami, I live in the state of Florida, you want to talk about election problems? Come on down to Miami-Dade or Broward County or Palm Beach County. No hanging chats, we've done away with those. And the election was boring in that sense of election observation. It was interesting and exciting for those who were for Zelensky. It was terribly disappointing for the pro-Poroshenko camp. But in terms of carrying out and conducting an election, Ukraine has really got it down. Two big exceptions, of course, 2010 local elections and the 2004 second round that was forced into a rerun. But Ukraine knows how to conduct elections and it can do it rather well. The fact that the president of Ukraine is Jewish and the fact that that didn't matter in this election, in a country where anti-Semitism is at the lowest levels in the region, the fact that the prime minister, maybe outgoing prime minister, is Jewish, speaks well of Ukraine. And I think one should not take that for granted. It certainly undermines the Kremlin argument, the absurd claim that Ukraine is run by fascists and neo-Nazis. It's a little harder to make that argument, though I'm sure the Kremlin will continue it, when you have a president who's Jewish and the current, probably soon to be outgoing prime minister who is Jewish as well. The church issue, I have a more positive take on this than Kyle. I think this was very positive for Ukraine. Is a further statement of its total independence from Russia. And I think that is healthy for Ukraine. And I think every country, should it want to move in this direction, should feel free to break from the Russian Orthodox Church's very unhelpful influence if it chooses to. When I was there for the second round this time, I was struck by an election official out near the airport where we went to observe, and she came up to me in tears. She was heartbroken over the terrible difficulty she had simply to put food on her table. And I think this is one of the challenges that Zelensky is going to face, which is those who voted for him are going to want to see change yesterday, not tomorrow. And the expectations of him are almost going to be impossible to meet. I worry a little bit that this is like Yushchenko in 2005. And I think back to April of 2005 when he gave a speech to the joint session of Congress, which I think was his high point, and everything sort of went downhill from there. The expectations that Ukrainians had for Yushchenko, the expectations that Americans, including in the U.S. government, and I was serving in the government at that time, had for Yushchenko, were never going to be met. And I think we all have to remind ourselves that with the Rada elections coming up, whether it's July or October, it's going to be difficult for Zelensky to get anything done in the near term. And so we have to be careful about building up expectations that will be impossible for any leader to meet. And those expectations, however, are not going to answer the woman who came up to me in tears. And Ukraine's leaders, whether in the government, presidential administration, or in the Rada, have to recognize that there are Ukrainians who are suffering enormously. And I'm not talking about the people living in the war zone. That's a whole different category of suffering. And those people too cannot be forgotten, to say the least. I do think that the impact Putin has had, it has been to bring the country closer together. When you're invaded by a bigger power, that tends to happen. And so, inadvertently, I think Putin deserves a little credit for bringing Ukraine closer together. And I do think that there is more cohesion in society. But at the same time, I was talking to Maury earlier, we have to be careful not to take for granted pro-Western sentiment in Ukraine and think that that will last forever. That then imposes on us a responsibility and burden to match that desire to integrate more closely into the Euro-Atlantic community by following through and helping Ukraine move in that direction. If we don't, and the reason I mentioned Georgia is we're seeing an erosion in Georgia, arguably the most pro-Western, pro-American country in the region, erosion in support for joining NATO in Georgia, because they're not seeing much since the commitment in Bucharest in 2008 that Georgia and Ukraine will become members. And we make a mistake if we take for granted that, well, we don't have to worry about that. Georgia will always want to join the West, even if we don't show reciprocal interest. That may not be true. Because at the end of the day, barring a massive earthquake, which none of us wants to see, Georgia's always going to border Russia, and Ukraine's always going to border Russia. And there will be some people in these countries who will decide if the West isn't going to be there for us, we have to make the best deal we can with the neighbors that we have. And so there is a responsibility that we have to do what we can to help promote cohesion, to help the new government, to help the new Rada, to help civil society, to help journalism, and to help those who are suffering and those who are trying to defend their country against outside aggression, so that Ukraine becomes a more successful country. When Ukraine succeeds, and by that I mean becoming a prosperous, democratic country, more deeply integrated into the Euro-Atlantic community, becoming a member of the EU, becoming a member of NATO, that will not only redound to the Ukrainians' benefit, it will redound to Belarus's benefit, and ultimately to Russia's benefit. And let me tell you, that will be a good day for the United States as well. Thank you.
Before we finish, could you give us some grades?
Oh, grades. I'm a very generous grader at FIU. So I'm going to give an overarching grade because I don't want to break it down into things. I would say when it comes to cohesion, I would say B plus A minus.
For all the categories?
Yes, across the board.
Okay.
My students like me because of that.
Okay, Louis?
Great. I took a little different approach to this one because I knew I'd...
Did you actually answer the questions?
You want to talk about something completely different?
Because this topic was
Moldova.
cohesion, and the next one is national identity, so I had a hard time kind of differentiating the two. But I took a kind of a deeper academic dive, let's say, because I knew I'd be next to two practitioners. I did want to start off with, I thought what Ms. Hopko said was compelling, and it was a real wake-up call to this audience. So I was really appreciated what she said. That's completely not connected to this topic. I'll start with the academics of social cohesion. The best term I came across in the literature was that it's defined by a multidimensionality and as much social inclusion as possible. The UN has done a lot of work in the eastern Ukraine, and they use an index called the Social Cohesion Index and Revitalization. So somehow they throw the word revitalization into social cohesion, and I think that's not a bad thing. And their focus is on East Ukraine, and I was very surprised with the sense of harmony they saw in the eastern Ukraine. A little non-traditional in that I spent my summer vacation in Vuhledar. In Donetsk Oblast, and I took my daily trips on it. That was my vacation. I would take the Mashruki every day to the block point and visit the Russian soldiers and drink Kurilka with them. So I was a little surprised because I felt when I was in Vuhledar, I felt I was in the 1950s. I felt it was They didn't know where to turn. Russia, U.S., everyone's promised them things. They were an island, like I said in the 50s, that from 5 o'clock till 8 o'clock at night, they were out with their prams. Everybody had a baby, no matter how old they were. And it was just it was a scene from the 50s and 60s. It was a place going nowhere and not knowing where to go. But I'm optimistic. That sounds worse than the rest of what I'm saying. Part of the index was also fragmented society and fractured communities, and I do see that in Ukraine, but I'm going to get to a positive. According to literature, Ukraine is a multi-ethnic, multi-language, and multicultural country, home to nearly 130 nationalities, 22% being ethnic minorities. The new president, I think we have a blank slate, and it's way too early to say what's going to happen. Some of the literature that I was looking through, I'm sorry, these guys are on the ground and practitioners and they go see observe elections, so I went a little more academic. A lot of the literature I see seems to think that the great uniter will be this decentralization, these amalgamated territory communities. So one went as far as say decentralization will bring social cohesiveness, stability, effectiveness, functionality, and dynamism. And I wrote a note here, if only that simple. Of course, we have the small issues of interethnic relations, interfaith relations, and class and oligarchies and regional differences. So this summer for my vacation, I'll be in Carpathia and Mukachevo, so it'll be a little nicer. But all I keep hearing about is watch out for the Hungarian ladies. Which we know. So I run a program that's called the Open World, the Ukraine program for the Open World Leadership Center, and since the elections, we've had over 100 Ukrainians visit us. Hi, welcome back to DC. We've had women veterans, we've had IDPs, we've had regional development experts, part of the Doherty Project, or the amalgamated cities as well, healthcare reform experts, decentralization experts, women in agriculture, thanks to the great support of Ms. Capter. And I do see a kind of, I'd say, a cohesion. Something's coming together. It's generational. Oh, I'll have plenty of time. Don't worry about that. I'm almost done. These guys talk longer. So, sorry. Well, you guys have been doing it longer than me. I'm a bureaucrat. I run an exchange program. So, I do see, as you said, David, Russia is a great uniter, phenomenal uniter. And I have a little debate on whether, well, I think the Ukraine defeat, a military defeat of Russia would be the best thing for Russia. But I don't think Mr. Putin would think so, at least, because he's president for life.
Well, he doesn't have Russia's interest in mind either.
I agree with that too. Yes. So yes, so that's another debate. My kind of overall conclusion is, and I can go into the interethnic and talk about East and West and Tymoshenko and why they couldn't form a government and why Baltashina and all the parties didn't get together, and interfaith we can talk about the new head of the Catholic Church that's now moved back, Mr. Jurkiw, who's done incredible work with the university there, an incredible fundraiser, an incredible hero for Ukraine. So I'm going to cut right to the chase. For interethnic, I thought we're at a B, a solid B. I think Ukrainians seem to be getting along, and I'm fortunate to have the last name Maidan, but I'm only a Russian speaker. But none of my Ukrainian friends seem to mind anymore, as long as I could say "Ya ne razluvai, no ya rozuneyu," and that gets me fine. And once I say my familia Maidan, I'm 100% good. Then I say my blood is 100% Ukrainian Jewish, and I'm even better. Miroslav has heard this all 100 times. Yeah. And I'm Jewish, right? So, or prime minister. So for interethnic, I felt a B. For interfaith, I also felt a B. I don't see these as big problems now amongst the Ukrainians that I deal with on a regular basis. I do think the class issue, I'm not as optimistic as my friend, longtime friend Kyle, since 2000. God, I'm just getting younger, I keep getting older. I think the class conflict is something that's coming to a head. That scares me. Fight against the oligarchy. Maybe I lied. Maybe I will take up my time. So I do think the class issue is going to come to a head. the oligarchs, the anti-corruption, the courts. Something's going to happen. I don't think it's going to be solved by the courts. That's for sure. Except maybe these grassroots level courts that they're trying to start. And I give class a C, even a C minus. And I do think the regional issue, I think it's getting better thanks to Russia. For the want of a nail, I guess. And so I give the regional differences as a B as well. I think I come across as a B or a B minus on these 4 issues.
In civil military?
I must have done an early draft, because I don't see civil military.
No, we had civil
Civilian
military
military.
at one point, but we decided to drop it. We decided to stay strictly with that issue and leave the civilian military
Oh, you want to leave
with
it?
the security.
But civilian military, I don't know, it's funny, I'll give a quick. I was warned not to bring IDPs and veterans together because veterans are hostile towards the IDPs because they're getting resources. I had no problems. They wanted to support each other. They wanted each other to have resources. So if I had engaged that one, I would do it. I would do that one probably the best of all, an A minus or a B plus.
Interesting.
At least from what I've seen observed from 100 Ukrainians since the election. So it's a small focus set. So that's where I would be. But overall, I'm at a B or a B minus for this whole section.
Can I just say-
And I'm optimistic.
But I thought the Jewish fascist that Putin was looking
Yeah, well, him too. I got two.
Can I just say, I've never given a grade in past years. I've always given incompletes, so this is the first year.
Yes,
voted
yes, that you gave a grade. Yes.
All right, thanks very much. I'll total them up while we get into questions. We have
Thanks.
a bit of time now.
Yeah, you do.
About 10, 15 minutes. Let's open it up, please, for
Questions, anyone?
please.
Oh,
Do you have a microphone?
I can project.
Shout.
Yeah, from personal experience, from traveling to Ukraine every summer and living there for a majority of my life, I see that Ukrainians in the West and Ukrainian communities abroad are a little bit hostile towards Ukrainians coming into the West from East, speaking Russian, and sometimes bringing in pro-Russian sentiment, and thus that divides the people in Ukraine, what we were talking about, the cohesion. And I believe that that's a really big issue, not only of the linguistic aspect of it, but also how the Ukrainian community back at home is responding to the laws being in place right now. So I'd like to see what your opinion on that is.
Are you saying Ukrainians coming to the United States, or Ukrainians going from east to west Ukraine?
Oh, no, from East to West Ukraine.
From east. Okay, so not coming here, but going to...
between Yeah.
regions of
Yeah,
Ukraine.
yeah. Well, and you've also had that, with a lot of the IDPs, because IDPs have been, I mean, the bulk of the IDPs are in cities like Kharkiv, but there's certainly plenty scattered across the entire country when you look at how many have been dispersed. I was thinking, Ukrainians coming here, I can't help but remember, some early experiences. My wife, who's a Ukrainian citizen, born and raised, and taking her to some of the Western Ukrainian events around town, like the Pisiki workshop and the things up at the shrine, and introducing, say, oh, my wife's Ukrainian, and then they start talking, and as soon as they hear her Russian, it's sort of, not a coldness, but a bit of an uncomfortable pause, and feeling like, hey, wait a second, she's more Ukrainian than you are. You're from Cleveland,
Don't tell Cleveland gang that.
No, I don't want to tell the Cleveland gang that. Or fight. But I do think it's really important to understand that Russian culture didn't start this war. Ukraine isn't at war with Pushkin. We study Shakespeare. It doesn't mean we're royalists,
Pushkin
right?
wasn't imperialist,
Well, you might, but this idea. I mean, I keep going back to you talk to people who aren't so well, and they say, well, the Russians trace their history back to the city of Kiev. So you know what? No one else traces their history back to the city of Kiev. Ukrainians. Right? I mean, and I'm wondering how crazy it is to sort of like to look at this attack on Crimea as almost a revisiting of Pereyaslav, right? And saying, why do we automatically assume that the mantle and inheritor of Rus has to be Moscow, right? And you have a large portion of Ukraine that, to where Russian was never imposed, where it's always been there, the Slobozhanщina and places like that. And you know, those are Ukrainian citizens, right? They're not deficient. And again, that's why I think the question on how this language thing is handled and where does Ukraine go with it? Does it go the Baltic path or does it go the Canadian path? I would like to see it go the Canadian path, but again, that's just me.
Anybody else?
We got about 2 seconds on this. We do a lot of work with the IDPs. Well, we're about $1 million. I know there's an association with universities from Donetsk and Luhansk that are now located in Vinnytsia. But I think that's the biggest problem, east-west now. But it's a tough problem. It certainly is a tough problem. The Russian speakers going to Lviv and Carpathia. But I think this new president. I don't know where it's going to go, but I don't think this is going to be an issue into the future. Even with the Hungarians and the Carpathians, I think they're going to realize that unity of a country is far more important than languages. At least I think that's where the trend is. That's where modernity is taking us. And I hope so. Maybe that's wishful thinking.
Okay, thanks, Liz. I think I saw a hand back here. Yeah, please.
If you look at
David, do you want to? No. No, okay, please.
If you look at the demographic older than 60 and that younger than 40, are there clear differences politically and socially? And will the natural course of biology change the political cohesion, social union of Ukraine?
And he's from Cleveland.
Well, I forgive you for your comment.
I'm not that old, so I'll let these guys.
David,
Thank you. I don't know that I have a good answer, to be honest. You know, I made a reference before about the leaders Ukraine has had. You know, one of the challenges Ukraine has had, I think, has been that it's been the same faces over and over and over. And Zelensky is a new face in the sense of the political arena, but he's a well-known entity from his ties to television. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, because even the ones who have been president or prime minister or in the Rada before are going to recycle one way or the other. And in terms of the broader population, some of them are leaving, which is not good. Hopefully some who are leaving will go back. But the older population, I think, is the one that tends to suffer the most, and the one that maybe wrongly, in my view, but I guess I understand why, yearns for the old days. The old days sucked. And people have amnesia, I think, when it comes to, well, it wasn't so bad in the old days. It was horrible in the old days. And there's not a place that I think suffered more, obviously in the 30s in particular, but also during World War II, than Ukraine, and that was largely the result of Stalin. So the old days were not good days, but people are struggling. I mean, Ukraine, I don't quite buy this, but according to the World Bank, it's supposed to be the poorest country in Europe now. Having been to Moldova quite a few times, I would rather live in Ukraine than Moldova with all due respect.
You said about Albania.
Right, no, exactly. And everything's relative. Sometimes statistics get in the way of the reality of the situation in the country. So what I'm worried about is that young Ukrainians not become apathetic. If Zelensky does not live up to the expectations that people have, and there's a good chance he won't in many respects, to be honest. But if they don't, then if young Ukrainians just throw up their hands and say, well, we tried, we rolled the dice, we took a chance with a new guy, that didn't work out either. That's a problem I think the country could have. 63% turnout, though, in both rounds puts us to shame, and that's impressive. And so I hope that is a sign that despite their frustration with the powers and the people in power that they've had, they'll still try to bring about change.
Yeah, just to add, Dave, the fact that people still have some enthusiasm, still participate, haven't given up on everything, on politicians. Right. I mean, the fact that there isn't widespread apathy in Ukraine is a surprise after disappointments, but there isn't. So there is a hope in the national core.
Sorry, just one other thing quickly, sorry. I know other people want to jump in. I actually can't think of another country that twice in a decade went out in the streets the second time at enormous cost to demand better from their government. So that speaks enormously of Ukraine and its people. And they didn't know the first time that there wouldn't be bloodshed. They anticipated there might be bloodshed the second time, and it was worse than I think they anticipated. And I do think that if somehow things go really badly with this new government, they'll turn out a third time. And I hope that isn't necessary. I hope it doesn't happen. Ukrainians have become really good at revolutions. Now they need to focus on governing. But I do think that if things don't go the way most people hope, they will express themselves very clearly.
I have one quick comment.
Yes, sure.
I do think, and I'm not very optimistic about this, I do like the way the slates, we haven't really discussed any much the upcoming Verkhovna elections. And I'm seeing young, on all the party, across the lines, so maybe I'm one of the opposition quads, maybe, but I'm seeing a very young, dynamic, kind of like we felt about maybe some opponents in a moment, but I think that election for the Verkhovna Rada, whether it be July, whenever it's going to be, is going to be a really important one to see how the new Rada looks like.
That's
Walter, you can jump in.
You know, it's actually a question that I was going to ask for all four of you, because you really are the experts in this field. I think that this panel itself, every one of you can answer this. And you've known Ukraine enough to answer it. Do you think that the Komsomol leadership that should have been removed in '91, I remember a lot of ambassadors of ours have said that in New York in their events, that the Komsomol leadership could have been removed in '91 because the national commies were in full retreat and the national Democrats were moving forward. Do you think that finally the era of the Komsomol leadership, especially with the Zelensky thing, and even in Poroshenko, I mean, in both things, but not so much Poroshenko, but the Olkos and so and so, but the youngsters you see here, do you think that that leadership is finally about ready to assume, or is there still the smell of Komsomol? Is that still going to linger for another 10 years and give us more corruption? Because I think the corruption comes out of that Komsomol structure that was there in Russia as well.
Yeah,
Kyle gets a tough one.
I'm sorry about that, but I just thought it was a serious question and I needed to ask it.
You know, I think that one of the things I'm hoping for Ukraine, and really we're talking about apathy, right? I mean, I'm not worried about any deficit in apathy. But Ukraine is. I mean, Ukraine knows where the bums live and have gotten Ukrainians gotten pretty good at throwing them out when they need to be thrown out. And you've had such transition. I mean, I still go back to this photo that was somewhere in early 2014, and it was like Kravchuk, Kuchma, and Yushchenko, like all at a, I don't know, maybe they were at Dynamo Kiev or something like that. But the idea that where else in this region do you have three former leaders? So the more you have that transition and the ability to break the corrupt structure and not allow anything to ossify and shatter the elite over and over again, you get exactly what happened in successful transitions in Eastern Europe, and you get exactly what has not happened in Russia. And the danger, of course, is that people, that the call to stability is too alluring, right? I mean, you can get the stability, and in Russia you can sort of have the stability of the graveyard, right? It's pretty stable in a graveyard. But I see whether it's Moldova or other places where you say, hey, these types of transitions are messy. They lurch one way, they lurch another way. But in doing that, you flush that system. You break those networks. I don't know if that's
two more questions. You want to go first?
So my question is, Louis Madanick had mentioned that with Zelensky being president may lead to certainly decentralization and then therefore more social cohesion in that sense. But also Dave mentioned that there are also great expectations for this new president. So when you look at that balance, and I think it was also just mentioned with the question from Kyle Parker answered, but when you look at the balance between these two ideas from both expectations that based on how people, or based on how he fulfills those expectations for different groups of people, will that actually lead to more cohesion or a greater divide?
Thank you. I'm not sorry.
My quick answer would be more cohesion. I can't see. I see it as an evolution. I see it as age. To me, it's a long process. It's a simple process. It's a painful process. But with that closeness and proximity to Europe, pipeline issues, dependence on, I can't see Ukraine, same with Georgia, going any other way. I just can't. Maybe I'm a Euro optimist, but it's going to be painful. But I think a lot of the hurdles have been passed. But it's definitely, there's pain ahead.
Last question.
I think
we'll comment. Oh, you want to say something?
I was just going to say quickly, the fact that Zelensky is such a newcomer is both a positive. There can be a downside to it, though, which is his lack of familiarity with the right people for positions and his dependence on some people whom he should not rely on for advice on positions to fill. And that can be at the central level in Kiev, it can be at the local level as well. That, I think, is going to be one of his big problems. From what I understand, I've never met the guy. He was quite confident from the beginning that he was going to win, but I didn't see a lot of preparation for what he anticipated was going to be victory, where he had his teams already lined up, ready to go. It seems like he waited until after the election was over before really figuring out how he was going to staff up. And that can lead to some problems, as we've already seen with a few positions. And so I hope that doesn't become a broader problem throughout the entire country.
Please.
Thank you everybody for being here. I wanted to jump off the point that David made earlier about apathy. So for the last 3 years, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine, in kind of western central Ukraine, Khmelnytsky Oblast, a small town called Kiev, very, very small town. Beautiful place, unforgettable experience. My primary role was being a teacher, and so I taught English at a secondary school, and I had some of the greatest kids I've ever met, great students, very intelligent, very smart, but I had students who were sometimes in the 4th or 5th grade. When I asked them about their future, they said, well, I'm going to move to Europe, or I'm going to move to America or Canada. I don't see a future here. These were like 4th graders and 5th graders, talking about corruption, talking about issues they saw in the country, and kind of generally having a pessimistic attitude. So I talked to them about the positivity of having that kind of that connection to your country and like things they can do and civic engagement and that things. And some of them did learn some skills from these kind of trainings. But in general, we're talking about populations throughout Ukraine. How can we engage Ukrainian youth to become more involved, to want to stay in Ukraine and kind of affect the future of Ukraine rather than the so-called brain drain that we have to Europe or other countries? How can we ensure that we have Ukrainians that stay in the country?
Anybody want to comment? Last chance?
That's a great question.
Invest in it.
Economic growth. I mean, sorry, I'm talking too much. Economic growth is obviously a key, and I think it is Europe and no visa regimes and the ability to migrate back and forth. I think when there's opportunity to both come back, and Kharkiv was also the first city island in Ukraine in '91. Believe it or not. And when you say, whoever knew that they'd be the Silicon Valley, right? Yeah. I know people moving from Poland back to Kharkiv.
Yeah.
So it's
kind of
still they're moving. Yeah. So
sort of a Ukrainian Ann Arbor. Heavy industry nearby, but lots of students. I think also on the corruption piece, right? Let's be realistic. Corruption's not going to ever go away. It just needs to get a little better, right? And a little bit of improvement is going to mean something, right? Look at some other states that have massive amounts of corruption, Italy or something like that. If we got Ukraine was like an Italian level corruption, that'd just be fantastic.
opportunity.
More than 20 years ago.
That's a form of corruption where things get done.
Right, so, no, but in the sense of having realistic expectations. I used to work.
That's a very good point.
I used to work for Chairman Elliot Engel, who himself is something of a founding father of Kosovo, right? And has a street named after him, and he even recently got a postage stamp. When we joked with him, we said, "Elliot, you know what's going to happen to all the mail that you put that stamp on? It's going to arrive late, because Elliot isn't late if he's not an hour late." But one of the things he sees Kosovo as, and he looks at this, he actually has family roots in Western Ukraine, but as that kid, the proverbial kid who had to walk to school uphill both ways in the snow, let's be realistic about what we're seeing in Ukraine, right? It is, you have a state that is a massive state to the north that's on all fronts trying to delegitimize it and is attacking it, and then Ukraine is fighting the textbook definition of a just war, right? Unprovoked foreign invasion. So I think we need to be careful what our expectations are, and again, for that opportunity, things just need to get a little better and move in the right direction, and that's going to turn the spigot on.
Okay, that's it.
We stayed within our
Time limit.
You sure did.
And I've actually averaged out the grades. The B's have it. The kinds of B's. Interactive relations B, solid B. Interfaith B+. Class, however it's defined, B-. Regional B. And civil military, from what I got from those who did speak about it, and I did mine, I'd say B+. So that's it. My invoice is in the mail.